Hey, my name is David Bureš. I'm a senior technical writer at USU Technologies.
My guest today is David Bureš, who is a senior technical writer. After starting as a web developer, he moved to the documentation and text translation space and has worked for Microsoft business applications like Power BI and Azure Suite, but also for Apple and Amazon, as well as running his own company. In his spare time, he still codes apps for macOS. His most popular project has almost 500 stars on GitHub. In this episode, we talk about documentation, of course, but also translation and localization. Don't know the difference? That's why you should listen. David gives lots of tips for better collaboration between PMs and technical writers and shares the good, the bad, and the ugly about working for big tech.
Welcome to Product Perspectives, the podcast for product people that gives a voice to their stakeholders, hosted by Magali Pellissier. Each weekly episode shows you the other side of the product with interviews of the people who contribute to making products a success. They are engineers, writers, marketers, support analysts, UX designers, or even salespeople. Not only will they get the credit they deserve, but they will share their perspectives on what makes a good product and product manager. Stakeholder management is a key skill for product managers. So just as you're obsessed with listening to your customers, let's hear from your stakeholders.
Thank you so much, David, for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk about one topic that I haven't talked about yet in the podcast, but I've worked very closely with people in that field before as a product manager. It's technical writing. So you are now a senior technical writer. Can you tell me how you went into that field? What's your journey?
Yeah, of course. At first, I never thought I would ever become a technical writer. I wanted to be a physicist, but then I discovered that, sciences are not the path for me. So I decided to focus on English, and I went to school for English translation and interpreting. So I'm actually a trained interpreter, and I worked in this field for a bit. But when the opportunity arose to become a technical writer, I seized that opportunity because it seemed to be much more interesting than what I was doing with translation. And it ended up being my calling in life. However, in the past, I almost became a programmer. It was actually my first job out of school. I worked as a developer, but I'm happy I didn't stick to that.
We're going to talk about this. And yes, we all have ideas of things that we want to do when we grow up. But most of the time, the people I talked to didn't know they would end up in this role because they didn't even know that was a thing. So you've mentioned one thing about being a programmer in the past. And I know that you still code your own apps on macOS and you still work on that. So why did you change?
I'll be completely honest with you. I didn't like the programmer lifestyle. All these buzzwords like, being agile, doing sprints and like whatever, like we all know like how that goes. And I didn't like that. It didn't fit my lifestyle, if I would say it that way. I think it was a bit too hectic for me. And it was also very mentally draining. So I ended up just being in that position for like not even a year. And then I immediately knew that this is not what I want to do with my life. But as you said, I still code in my spare time. So it's not that the passion completely escaped me, but now I just do it as a passion, not as a job.
Very interesting, actually, that you want to do something as a hobby and not necessarily as a job. How does that skill set of knowing how to program and develop apps complement your role as a technical writer?
Well, there's been a couple situations where my programming abilities came in very handy. For example, we were migrating from one very old software we've been using for 20 years to a new piece of technical writing software. But there was a little problem. The export bundle from the old software didn't include image captions, which is a huge problem when you have a document that has 500 of them. And the other writers, I guess, resigned to their fate that they would have to do this manually. But I decided to be lazy, and instead I coded a program which would take all of the captions from the old program and transplant them into the export bundle. So I saved many days of work that way, just because I knew how to program.
Great. That's a very good example. And I guess this is about automation, but I think it's also about language and how you can interact with developers and better understand what they're talking about when it's not buzzwords.
Yeah, for sure. I even sometimes find bugs that the QA team didn't find, because I always poke into the source code and discover that like some functions are not returning what they're supposed to be returning, and they're always like, "Oh, how did we miss that?" I'm like, "It's okay, it happens to all of us."
Well, that's bad. Did that happen? You don't have to say in one of the big companies you've worked for. So you worked for Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. I think some people would dream about these companies. So what have those companies taught you?
They taught me that writing things in a very exact way is very desirable. For example, with Apple, I was working on this document where they were really insisting on using the correct terminology. And it happened at Microsoft too. But Apple was really big into correct terminology and correct sentence structures. That's the biggest takeaway I have from working at these big companies. They also taught me that the American management system is not the best. Because, me coming from Europe, when they try to force into the American work culture of being always on call, taking no vacations, and just being stressed all the time, that didn't really sit right with me, which is one of the reasons that I didn't spend much time there. But it was still an interesting experience, I might say.
Great. Now, very interesting. You're right about the difference in culture. And the first point you mentioned about the level of expectation. So we're going to talk about more words, translation, localization. So what is your role? So you've got your own company doing translation. You also worked for some time at Netflix. What is the role about? And what is translation versus localization?
Translation is taking a sentence from the source language and translating it into the target language. That's what the translation is. But if you want to localize something, you also have to remember that different cultures have different ways of doing certain things. So, for example, if you want to translate phrases, if you would just translate a phrase from English, it wouldn't make sense in the source language, even though the words are exactly the same. But you have to also keep in mind that the target might say it in a different way, or they might have a phrase that means the same thing, but it's completely different. For example, kill two birds with one stone, and which in Czech we say kill three flies with one hit. So if you just translate it, like no Czech person would ever understand. And in my opinion, translation is a very difficult job, especially for the big companies. For example, at Netflix, you have to go through a lot of series very fast because the users are demanding that you release them as soon as they come out. So you have to have the subtitles ready for 20 languages. I was only taking care of the Czech part, but still some of the managers were very stressed out because they were under very tight deadlines, which might be a consequence of the American working culture. And I don't think that everyone is fit to be translator, because people always think like, oh, I can speak two languages. Like, oh, I can work as a translator. And let me tell you, you can't. I spent 3 years in college learning that, and I still sometimes felt like I couldn't do anything.
And we're going to touch on that. Definitely, I'm a native French speaker. I've been living for 8 years in the UK, but I don't think doesn't make me a great translator. So interesting move, because you went from translation to technical writing. So what is it that you like better in technical writing than in translation?
Technical writing allows me to be more creative, because with translation, you have those boundaries of the source language and you can add your own spin to things very well. With technical writing, you can be very creative, because usually at least you get a piece of software you're supposed to document, and then you get just a few requirements, like, oh, make it like this, like X pages long, make sure to include this and that. But the style, the way it's written, the structure, it's usually all up to you. So that's the biggest thing that I like more about technical writing compared to translation. And there is also the fact that with technical writing, you work with more diverse teams. You not only work with supervisors, you also work with the various subject matter experts. You have to interact with the programmers. You have to keep in touch with the project managers. Again, this might not be for everyone, but I have discovered that it is right for me because I enjoy talking to a lot of people and organizing that work. So I think those are the main reasons why I ended up being a technical writer instead.
No, I think these are great points. And what do you think is a common misconception that people have about translation that you disagree with?
That it's easy. Every time I told someone that I am a translator, they were always like, "Oh, I can speak English. I bet I will do a better job than you, with no training." But that's not true. There are so many variables you have to keep in mind. You have to keep the style consistent. You have to adhere to certain, to certain rules, right? So you can't just like make stuff up on the spot. People also think that translation and interpreting is the same thing. It's also not the same thing. Interpreting is, hearing one thing and immediately interpreting it into a different language. And it's also much harder than people realize. So I think the expectations that people have about translation are the biggest, the most different from what translation actually is.
Right. What about people would tell you that AI can do better translation? Is that true? Do you use AI? How do you think it would change translation?
There is still a lot to do in terms of AI. I have discovered that for very simple and easy tasks, AI can sometimes produce good results, but even in those most basic results, it still fumbles a bit. So I think the AI is slowly approaching the point where we might be able to use it. However, that point is still very far into the future. I'm not worried. I think if you are a translator, your job is very secure still.
Great. And I was looking at a company last time. They do translation and they claim to do it 5 times faster than other translation tools. And they do rely on a combination of AI and manual input to do that.
Yeah, that's a very big way of translating in Microsoft, actually. When I was working for Microsoft, most of my translations, when I was studying translations, they were something called machine translation post-editing, where they run source language through basically Google Translate, but they have their own proprietary program for that. And then you get the result, which is not perfect, but most of the structure is there. Then your task is to like basically fix it and make it seem like it was translated by a human. So this is a little insider knowledge, but that's how Microsoft does their translations.
Great. And they shouldn't stop at the machine translation. And I think that's what I was flying recently with Ryanair in Europe. This is a low-cost airline. And clearly they did not use a human because the translation of safety material in French was absolutely awful. Anyway, let's move on to technical writing. So technical writing, you say you interact with a lot more people. You interact with programmers, but also with product managers, with so many more people in the tech space. But I think as a product manager, sometimes we don't really understand what's the process from writing software to writing documentation. So can you shed some light on that?
Of course. Well, at least in the companies that I have worked at, usually software gets programmed, the programmers work on it. And then when it's approaching the release date, in my current company, it's about 2 or 3 weeks before the release, I get pinged on Teams that the software is going to be released soon. Now we're not going to be making any sweeping changes anymore. Now you can jump in and start documenting, which in my opinion is not the right approach, because then you have to like really very frantically write very fast because the release date is very close. I have never managed to actually release the documentation with the software because it tends to be frankly impossible to keep the deadline. I'm very lucky that my project managers and SMEs don't really mind this because they understand that writing is a long process, and because we have an agile way of programming the software, that things change very fast. So they can't just tell me, oh, this button is going to be blue. You can just write it down as, oh, press the blue button. And then in 2 weeks, there is a new sprint and they decide it has to be orange. Then I would have to like go back in and edit it. So even though it's not ideal, it's still the best way of doing it. After I'm done with changing everything that's changed in that release, I send it off to the SMEs. They give me feedback, send it back. I implement the feedback, and then usually at that point, I just release it because all of their points have been answered. There is nothing else to point out, nothing else to do. So at that point, I just consider it finished.
You've already mentioned some aspects, which are you have to collaborate with lots of people. Sometimes it's hard to adjust when the code and the product is changing very fast and you've got tight deadlines. So if there is a message you want to get across, what is it that you wish people understood better about the role?
I wish they understood that it's very important to be more integrated in the process of planning out the release. because it might not be true for our company much anymore. But I have seen in my previous jobs, especially at Microsoft, that they don't really include any of the writers in the meetings or anything. They just think, oh, they're just going to describe what we've done. It's like not a big deal. They don't have to be included in the meetings. But then, the time comes where you're supposed to start writing about a new release. And then you discover it like you have no idea what changed. So you have to figure everything out. It like wastes time. It wastes everyone's time. It wastes work. And it's just not pleasant. So I think that's my main message to all the PMs out there. Please include the writers more.
And that's exactly why you're in this podcast, to share this message and to have it heard by the right people. Talking about the positive side, I've got a question from a product manager for you.
Hi, I'm Henry, a product manager at USU working on self-service tools like the chatbot. So my question to you, David, is the following. Which part of your job do you like the most?
Well, I'll speak directly to Henry. I like you the most because you are very understanding, very patient, and very friendly. I think being approachable is a very important aspect of a PM's job. And I also like that PMs at our company are not very strict. And I think the wider community and the team spirit is very important, because when you have very friendly relations within the company and you're not exploiting the poor workers with tight deadlines and impossible requirements, it makes the job much more bearable to everyone included, not just the workers, but the PMs as well, because the workers are not mad with them. They can, work together as a team, which just smooths everything out.
Great. This is the first time that somebody said, oh, actually, this person does really well their job, and I find it very easy to collaborate with them. So can you give me some examples of what a good product manager does that is different from a less good product manager?
There are two main things that a great product manager does that a bad one doesn't. First one is that they are understanding. And second is that they are approachable. Because when you have a PM who does not understand that, for example, this part of the documentation took me a week more than was forecast, great product manager understands that, it happens sometimes. There are things you just can't foresee. Being approachable is also very important, because when a writer has a question, they have two options. Either they spend like 2 days trying to figure out on their own because they know that the PM is not going to help them, or they go to the PM, they explain their situation, and the PM is like, yeah, no worries, I know exactly what you need to do, and now the task that would take the writer themselves 3 days takes 5 minutes, which benefits everyone in the company.
Thank you for sharing those tips and I think those behaviors and ways of working with PMs. Definitely being approachable is so important, as I rely on other people to do my job and I need their help. Then I need to be available for other people who need mine. So you've got a question for me about ways of working with product managers as well.
Yeah, my question too is, do you believe that modern project management methodologies, like Agile, can be applied to any project out there? Or are there some projects that it might not be applicable to?
So you've touched on that, the fact that you are working right now with sprints and you have to be in sync with the sprints, but sometimes it means doing some rework. So to generalize a bit, I would say that some flavor of Agile, some flavor of the software development methods, or doing an MVP, for example, can be applied, I believe, to most projects. There are some fields, some industries like manufacturing or hardware, it may not fully apply. With some of the people I've talked to in the podcast as well, I believe that applies. So if you work on product marketing, which is a lot of writing content as well, if you work in customer support, I think a lot of these things, doing small things, often gathering feedback from users. I talk a lot with most stakeholders, most people I've got on the podcast, about the fact that they also apply a product methodology. So they seek feedback, then they do some prototyping, they test a small idea and all that. So I believe most of the time can apply. But I would say that if it poses some particular constraints for you, so for example, you have to rework 3 times the color of that button, I don't think it's the method that's necessarily the problem. It's probably that that method is not being applied properly, because you shouldn't have to change the color of that button 3 times. So there's something wrong at the source, which is the discovery phase and the deciding what is being built. And at the end of the day, if the product manager, as you described, is approachable and is willing to work together with you, then we should adapt to whatever works for you. And I've had, in my experience, 3 teams in the past, and each engineering team in squad, you call them, worked in a different way. And I, as a product manager, adapted to those different ways of working.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, because I think that there is no wrong methodology for once. There are just managers who apply it wrong. So I agree with you completely on that. Thank you. Thank you very much for the very insightful answer.
Great. So let's move on to fire questions. So I'm going to make several propositions to you. You pick one of them, your favorite. And if you want, you can elaborate on that. The first one is Microsoft or Apple?
My answer has to be Microsoft, because while Apple pays better than Microsoft, Microsoft is not going to destroy you for making one typo in a 200-page document, which is something that might have already happened to me. I spent 2 hours under fire for misspelling one word at Apple. So Microsoft has to be my choice.
And still you develop macOS applications.
I have something called the Stockholm Syndrome, you know.
Talking about Microsoft products then, because you worked on the documentation for Power BI and Azure. So Power BI or Azure?
My choice has to be Azure. While Power BI is always going to be here because businesses need it, I have discovered that Azure is more experimental. So it's much closer to what I enjoy. I enjoy exploring like new ways of doing stuff. I enjoy new techniques. So I think Power BI was a bit too stable for me, and I much more enjoyed working on Azure.
Slack or Teams?
Has to be Teams. You know why? Because I have not used Slack at all. So I can't comment on Slack. However, I have used Teams for a really long time. While it has its quirks, it's usable. So I think that's what's most important.
And yet, during our first call, I invited you to a Teams meeting and you asked me to jump on Zoom.
Oh, yes. Well, that's why I said most of the things work in Teams.
But luckily, you've got documentation to help you if something doesn't work.
Oh, yes, exactly. I know exactly where to look.
In person or remote?
The choice is clear for me, remote all the way. Because there are some roles where in-person is very important. There are some jobs that require that level of collaboration and tooling. But most jobs in software don't require you to be in person, and remote saves you time. It saves you money because on gas and stuff. It also saves the environment, because when you don't have to commute every day, the emissions go down. And if everyone who could work remote would work remote, it would go a long way to help the environment. So my choice is definitely remote.
A great answer. I love that, because it's beyond just how we work. It's also thinking about the bigger impact. Finally, in-house or freelance?
I did both in-house and freelancing in my days, and I would choose in-house because in-house you usually have better collaboration. And for you as a worker, in-house offers you more stability, and stability is something we don't have enough in today's world. So I think it's very important to have at least like one pin in your life that you can always rely on. And it has to be the stability of being employed in-house.
Thank you. So if we want to wrap up this conversation with one final piece of advice for product managers who are listening and they want to better collaborate with technical writers.
One piece of advice. Well, I have around 10 of them, but if I had to choose just one, it would definitely be remember that writers are also humans. Like we are not some kinds of machines that turn difficult text into an easy text. Just remember that the people who write are very creative and very driven. Very often they're very, very driven to do a good job. So please don't treat them as robots. Just remember they're also people with emotions who need your help sometimes.
Perfect. And if people want to carry on the conversation with you and hear those 9 other tips that you've got, how can they contact you?
There is many ways to contact me. It depends on what you're interested in. If you just want to talk to me, you can write to me on Twitter. My handle is @David Bureš, no spaces. If you are more interested in my professional work, you can check me out on LinkedIn. My handle is @Bureš, as in David, DV. And if you want look at my code, if you want to steal my code, you can have a look at my GitHub profile, which is also Bureš DB. So it depends on what your intentions are with me. So it's your take your pick.
And if they want to see your technical documentation, they look at the Power BI one?
They should look at the Power BI one. If they want to see my work, they have to get employed at Apple because I translated the employee handbooks. But if they really want to see my work at Microsoft, I am responsible for almost the entirety of the Azure documentation. They can just Google Azure documentation and they are sure to run into something that I wrote.
Brilliant. I love how you can just say, here's my work. It's everywhere under those big names.
Yeah. Well, also on Amazon, you mentioned you didn't forget to mention I worked at Amazon. I worked on garage doors. If you look up garage door on Amazon, I am responsible for those.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been so impressive to talk about all the documentation you've written, the difference between translation and localization, and how you moved into technical writing. And you've given me some tips as a product manager for better working with someone like you as a technical writer. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. If you have suggestions for topics and guests, or any feedback, you can write to Magali Pellissier at hotmail.fr.